The Wade Wilson case is one of the most shocking and memorable criminal cases in recent Florida history. Wilson, known for his distinctive heavily tattooed appearance, was convicted in June 2023 of the brutal murders of two women in Lee County, Florida, in October 2019. The case began on October 6, 2019, when Wilson met 35-year-old Christine Melton at a bar with live music in Fort Myers, Florida. After spending time together at the bar, Melton invited Wilson back to her home in Cape Coral. Once there, prosecutors say Wilson waited until Melton was asleep and defenseless before strangling her to death. In Wilson's own chilling words to detectives, "This is what I do with women. I use my charm. I use my good looks. That's how I got in her head." He described waiting until he was alone with Melton when there were no witnesses, before attacking her when she couldn't escape. Wilson told investigators that Melton couldn't get away from him even if she wanted to because he was too strong. After murdering Melton, Wilson attempted to put her body in the trunk of her car but was unable to lift her, claiming rigor mortis had already set in. Instead, he stole Melton's car and fled the scene. But Wilson's violent crime spree was not over. While driving Melton's stolen vehicle, he came across 43-year-old Diane Ruiz walking down the street. Wilson lured Ruiz into the car by pretending to need directions to a nearby school. Once she was in the vehicle, he strangled her to death as well. In an even more gruesome act, Wilson then ran over Ruiz's body repeatedly with the car. In a disturbing phone call to his biological father after the murders, Wilson callously described running over Ruiz's body until it looked like spaghetti. He showed no remorse as he confessed to both killings during these recorded calls, which were later used as evidence at his trial. When the case went to trial in 2023, Wilson's distinctive appearance made him stand out in the courtroom, with his face and head covered in tattoos, including words like "death" prominently displayed. Wilson looked like a comic book villain come to life. The crimes he was accused of were all too real. Prosecutors laid out the gruesome details of the murders for the jury. They described how Wilson used his charm to gain the trust of both victims before violently ending their lives. The state portrayed Wilson as a calculating predator who chose vulnerable targets and waited for the right moment to strike. Wilson's defense team attempted to argue that he suffered from mental illness and brain damage that impaired his judgment and behavior. They called a forensic psychiatrist to testify that Wilson likely had some form of psychotic disorder, though the doctor admitted he couldn't pinpoint an exact diagnosis due to Wilson's lack of cooperation during evaluations. The defense pushed the theory that traumatic brain injury or other neurological issues may have contributed to Wilson's violent action. However, they were unable to present conclusive evidence of any specific brain damage or disorder during the trial. After hearing all the evidence, the jury convicted Wilson on 2 counts of first-degree murder. In their verdict, they unanimously found that the murders were especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, key factor in death penalty cases in Florida. The jury then had to decide whether to recommend a death sentence or life in prison without parole. By a vote of 10-2, they recommended that Wilson be sentenced to death for his crimes. However, the final decision on sentencing rests with the judge. As the August 27, 2024 sentencing date approached, Wilson's defense team made a last-minute push for further neurological testing. They argued that brain scans could potentially reveal evidence of traumatic brain injury that might serve as a mitigating factor against the death penalty. The judge agreed to allow Wilson to be transported from jail to a medical facility for brain scans and other tests just days before the scheduled sentencing. This 11th-hour development added a new wrinkle to an already complex and high-profile case. The results of these tests, if they show any sign of brain damage or neurological issues, could potentially impact the judge's decision on whether to follow the jury's recommendation for death or opt for life in prison instead. The defense hopes that evidence of traumatic brain injury or CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, could provide some explanation, though not justification, for Wilson's violent behavior. However, even if the tests do reveal some brain abnormality, it's unclear how much weight that would carry, given the severity of Wilson's crimes. The brutal nature of the murders and Wilson's apparent lack of remorse are strong arguments in favor of upholding the death sentence. The case has drawn significant media attention, both due to the shocking nature of the crimes and Wilson's memorable appearance. His heavily tattooed face and notorious crimes have made him one of the most recognizable defendants in recent Florida history. Beyond the lurid details, the case has also sparked broader discussions about the death penalty, mental illness in the criminal justice system, and the role of neuroscience in determining culpability. Regardless of the final sentence, Wilson will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The only question is whether he will die by execution or natural causes in prison. As the sentencing date approaches, the victims' families anxiously await a resolution to this traumatic chapter. For them, no punishment can truly make up for the loss of their loved ones. But they hope the judicial system will deliver what they view as justice for Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz. The Wilson case also highlights some key aspects of Florida's criminal justice system, particularly around capital punishment. Florida is one of 27 states that still have the death penalty, and it has the second largest death row population in the country, with 278 inmates. However, the path from a death sentence to actual execution is long and complex. On average, death penalty cases in Florida go through about 10 years of appeals before reaching a final resolution. Some inmates have been on death row since the 1970s. This lengthy appeals process is designed to ensure that all legal avenues are exhausted before the ultimate punishment is carried out. But for victims' families, it can mean years or even decades of painful court proceedings and uncertainty. The case also demonstrates how advances in neuroscience are increasingly being brought into the courtroom, especially in capital cases. Defense attorneys often seek brain scans or other neurological evidence that might show their clients suffered from mental illness or cognitive impairments that affected their behavior. However, prosecutors and some experts caution against putting too much weight on such evidence, arguing that many people with similar brain issues do not commit violent crimes. As the sentencing approaches, all eyes will be on Judge Nick Thompson as he weighs the jury's death recommendation against any mitigating factors presented by the defense. His decision will likely be just the beginning of a years-long legal process as the case works its way through the appeals system. The morning of the sentencing will begin with a Spencer hearing, where both sides can present additional evidence relevant to the sentencing decision. This could potentially include the results of Wilson's recent brain scans, if they are available in time. The actual sentencing is scheduled for the afternoon. Whatever sentence is handed down, it's clear that Wade Wilson will never again be a free man. He will spend the rest of his days in the Florida prison system, either on death row or in the general population, serving multiple life sentences. His case will likely be studied by law enforcement, mental health experts, and criminal justice reformers for years to come. For the families of Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz, the sentencing may provide some sense of closure, but it can never erase the pain of their loss. Their loved ones were senselessly taken by a man who, by his own admission, viewed women as prey to be hunted and discarded. Whether Wilson lives or dies, their grief and trauma will continue. The Wade Wilson case serves as a stark reminder of the very real monsters that sometimes walk among us, hiding behind charming facades until it's too late. It raises difficult questions about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the limits of rehabilitation. And it forces us to grapple with the thorny moral and practical issues surrounding capital punishment in modern society. As Florida and the nation watch this case unfold, it will undoubtedly spark further debate about how our justice system handles its most violent offenders. The outcome may influence future capital cases, and could potentially impact death penalty policies in Florida and beyond. Regardless of one's views on capital punishment, the Wilson case is a tragedy on multiple levels. For the innocent victims whose lives were cut short, for their grieving families, and yes, even for Wilson himself, whose life took such a dark and destructive path. It's a stark reminder of the very worst of human nature, but also of society's attempts to grapple with such evils through the imperfect mechanism of the criminal justice system. As the final chapter of this case plays out in the courtroom, it will serve as a somber reflection on violence, justice, and the never-ending quest to balance punishment with the possibility of redemption, even in the face of society's most heinous crimes.